Basically, it's a great warning and it's great education. I have a principle, which is if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry. Because if you worry and you understand what's likely, then you're likely to deal with it better than if you're just not worrying about it. And so it paints a picture that's clear and you can take it or leave it. What I found in my life is that most of the things that surprised me were things that never happened in my lifetime before. That taught me that I needed to study past history. For example, studying the Great Depression allowed me to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. I wouldn't understand it. Some of these things come along once in a lifetime kind of thing. And there were three things that came along that I needed to understand better to do my job. This was done as a study, but the three things that were really unprecedented in my lifetime were, first, the amount of debt creation and debt monetization. In other words, the printing of money to buy government debt is unprecedented. The finances are unprecedented. And as a financial person who watches economics, I saw how it passes through the system. And that's always happened throughout history, that mechanic, but it's unprecedented magnitude. The second is the magnitudes of the internal conflict, which are the greatest, coming from the largest wealth and income gaps, the largest political gaps since 1900. I like to measure things, and so you see these charts, and you see it goes back to 1900. And the third is the rising of a great power to challenge an existing great power. China rising to challenge the United States. And those three things coming together, individually, they didn't happen before in my lifetime. And then coming together was unprecedented. So I needed to understand certain things, like January 6th didn't come out of nowhere, okay? It germinated and it's coming to the surface. And when we go through it and extrapolate it and we understand how these things, it's telling about 2022, 23, 2024. And if I don't understand these things, it's like not understanding the Great Depression when the 2008 financial crisis. So I did the study. I'm very lucky that I could speak with practically anybody in the world and I talk about things. We have interesting conversations. I learned a lot and they told me, how important it is. That's why Henry Kissinger, Bill Gates, a lot of people. So that's why I put it out, because I think it's important that I have to be realistic. And I want to look at things realistically and be accurate, and including the bad things. Think about if you had a disease, a terminal disease, would you want to know? Or you have a particular problem, would you want to know? Only by knowing and understanding. Don't be shy from knowing because it's discomforting. It's scary to me to not know. Step back and look at a picture of history. Like I say, war, 1945, the cycle repeats. I could describe the cycle if you like. You have a cycle that then ends up in a conflict. When you have internally, when you have large wealth gaps and bad finances, and then externally, when you have a power that's challenging you, the probabilities of a conflict rises. And you see this through history. And they last, these world orders, 75 or 100 years or so. Last one began in 1945 at the end of World War II. And I was very lucky. You've been very lucky. It's in the beginning part of that cycle. And then you get a new generation of people who didn't go through the war. My parents went through the war, and therefore they're less aware of it. They're less aware of what causes it. But you see signs of these things, right? Like the January 6th is a symptom. You can imagine that in 2024, maybe neither side will accept losing. Now, if you have neither side accepting losing, and then you may not have resolution of that according to the Constitution and in terms of law. And then you have a power conflict. That has a profound change. Now, that's not far-fetched. It shouldn't be far-fetched from anybody. And if you look at the patterns of history, you see that always the extremes tend to become greater and those in the middle disappear because, there's another principle, which is when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And so when you get into an environment where I want to have you fight for my cause and win at all costs, history has shown you go to greater and greater polarity and you do have a fight. And that respect for things like the technicalities of law and the Constitution. Think about it. It's a remarkable system that we have, that when you have somebody by a few votes win the popular vote and somebody win the electoral vote, that they say, yeah, I got it, and I'll step away and I'll operate by that. That can't be taken for granted. So these things exist. You need to know it. That's part of the cycle. For example, the inclination to war very much changes. Those people who went through those types of a war say, I never want to go to a war. The peace is just so important. The people who wanted most to fight regretted going into wars. And yet the new generation, in a sense, who hasn't been through a war, then basically says, I'm going to fight for this thing. And then they get into wars. And so there's a generational psychology change, even appreciating basics. Can I secure my basics? Those people want to basically take the worst case scenario and secure their basics. A lot of people just think that that's nutty because they haven't been through it. But if you see the patterns, that's what the book shows. It goes back 500 years and you can just see them. They go like this for the same reasons. So it shows the causality of them. I think people have got to understand that causality. And we also can deal with it individually. So there's the collective. How do we collectively operate to make sure we don't have terrible things happen? And then there's individually. If we can't change things, how do I individually navigate this? And so what I had hoped to do, and you see the charts and you see the dot plot, and you can then plot where you're going with numbers. These aren't opinions, as you know in the book. These are numbers and graphs of things, so you can plot and you could add your dot plot and know where you're going and to know something about, okay, what do I do if this happens so I'm not surprised? So there's the individual taking care of himself. And then there's also, what do you do to avoid this thing happening? That's mechanistic. 2 years ago, I did a study. When you say we're getting more money, I just want to be clear that what happened was a lot of sending out more checks. We all have now that's been sent out a lot of money, but they just increased the amount of money. And you don't get richer by increasing the amount of money. The only way you get richer is by increasing production. And so what we're seeing is a higher level of inflation taking away those gains. And so when you have the combination of the three, the bad finances, if you're spending more than you're earning and you're printing money to do that, that's a sign. Second sign, big wealth gap. You're not going to raise that. Irreconcilable differences that people will fight over. And third sign is the rise of an external power or threat and competition that ends up happening at the same time. That confluence is something. And so it's very real. You're talking about it. I live in Connecticut. And Connecticut has one of the three highest per capita incomes in the country, but a big wealth gap. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut are either disengaged or disconnected. Disengaged means that they have an absentee rate which is greater than 25%, and
Wow.
They're failing classes. And disconnected means they don't know where they are, they've dropped out. So 22% of the high school students in the richest state in the country are in that condition, okay? And you're seeing people move from New York and places, California and so on. There's big things going on. It's a combustible set of circumstances. And therefore, what's happening in terms of populism of the left and the right, and that whole dynamic is very, very normal, very understandable, even though it hasn't happened in our lifetimes. Power, there are different kinds of power. I go through the 8 different types of power. Economic power and military power are both going together. Russia was never an economic competitor, okay? China is economically competitive. Just put it this way. China has a population that's more than 4 times that of the United States. So if per capita income is half the United States, that'll mean that it'll be economically twice the United States. That means it can also spend on military and other things in a way that is very, very different. So it's a whole different kettle of fish. I think first, there are different approaches, different ways of doing things. And I think the real question is whether one is imposing the other on each other. So should we be threatened by that? I mean, they're certainly threatened by the competition, but should we be threatened by that? And I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is how strong is America? Okay, it's simple. Just be strong. The big war is with ourselves that's standing with this internal conflict and the financial things. If we can be strong and do those things right, then we're going to be in the best of shape. There'll be less threat. And there are 5 types of wars, history has shown, and we see it all the time. There's a trade war. There's a technology war. There is a geopolitical influence war, which is influenced by the first 2. There's a capital war, and then there's a military war. We are certainly in the first 4 of those, and that's really a competition. So how can we be effective in trade American inventiveness to make technology the best we possibly can? What about the geopolitical influence? And then, of course, capital markets. That's a big advantage. So those are the things that will influence, and how competitive we are is almost everything in that game. As you come down there and you have this set of conditions, you have both sides saying, this isn't right, and they fight for each other. So you go to greater levels of extremism and wanting to fight with each other. So there's populism of the left and populism of the right. And it hits at the core values. So you're seeing a big difference in values. And that causes the fighter and the fighting. Candidates now don't want to thoughtfully present their perspective, listen to the other candidates' thoughtfully perspective, have a debate about which is best, and have the populace consider both of those and make a vote. That's passé. It is fight for me and win at all cost. And the political system, by its nature, reinforces that, because each of the parties has a moderate part and a less moderate part. To use an example, maybe 30% of the population is fairly right, a lot right, let's say, and 30% might be a lot left. And you got 60% of the population. They represent a large part of each party. And so you have primaries now in which are going on. 2022 will be first a primary battle, because what they will do is say who will be the winner. And each of those fights will be who is going to fight for me. And moderates don't come across like they're the fighters for me. And so the parties tend to move more and more to the extreme for the big fight. And that's like the big fight in 24. And as I say, it's entirely possible, or almost probable, that neither side would accept losing. Okay, now that's a different world. How is that resolved? It's resolved through power. That is not something that's far-fetched. And in order to understand how it's worked the same way. In the book, you go through, you see these patterns. You know, the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. I mean, it's the same thing in terms of the polarity, and you can't be in the middle. It's dangerous to be in the middle.
Yes.
You have to pick a side and fight. And it's like watching the movie happen over and over again. You see this happen this way. So we're talking about it. It's like if you read the stories happening over and over again, you get it. It creates the dot plot, and you can then fill it in. And hopefully we will see a deviation from that dot plot. The world and the countries have more resources than they've ever had before. We know more, we can do more, than we can have a higher living standard than we ever had before if we can cooperate, and we must cooperate, because look at what that alternative is. So there are things, that we can do. I'm not saying they're easy, but the alternative is scary. There's a great deal of change that has taken place at a very fast pace, and the communications of what people are seeing. When you go to work, you're doing your work and you're not dealing with the issues. And so you have something in common, perhaps. But when you're really dealing with the actual measures of what they say and how they vote or actions they take, and you plot those things, you put numbers to them and you plot those things, you could see what's happening. And it's not civil debate. I described how it used to be that both candidates would present their positions and what the country and people would consider that in the vote, and how it's all different. Yes, it's very, very different. And you do the dot plot and you can see that. So yes, I think, do we have irreconcilable differences? I think that's the real question. If you hear a lot of these issues, we do, and people will move. They'll change location, not just because of taxes, but because of going to be with people whose values and their circumstances are more like them. And you're seeing that happen. And I think you'll see a big difference probably between the relationship of states and the federal government. I think more in the future, states' rights and controlled by power. Like the sanctuary city issue. When the federal government says you should do this, and the state or local government says I'm not, then you have the breakdown of the system. They don't just go to the rule. Then you have a power-driven set of circumstances. And I think we're moving. We know it's more like that than it was. If you look at history, that's what I'm saying, I think is pretty clearly going on. I mean, why do they move from California to Texas? all the surveys show that large majority, really, you would take the population. There's a middle, but if you take those that have fundamentally big differences in terms of demonizing the other, say, I don't want to be with the other, those kinds of things, it represents something like 60% of the population. That's not made up. That is a reality. And you see that demonization in these patterns. And you see how it works with the media. So there's a dynamic that you see repeat over and over again. And the media, certainly true today, also likes to sensationalize and be on one side or the other and demonize. And so to find out what's true and to balance things, like what are the pros and cons, is not really common. It barely exists. And it's difficult. It's not easy to be in talking about the reasonableness and the issues of both sides and to try to deal with the merit of both sides. I guarantee you, like the history, the middle gets imprisoned or shot. Larry Summers described it to me. He said the average time horizon is 9 months in the future, roughly 9 months in the future. And then there's motivations. For example, giving people more, which means spending more, which means you can borrow and spend more. Nobody pays attention to whether that spending is coming from borrowing. Then leads to, I will be a more popular candidate if I borrow and spend more, and I will get elected, and then somewhere down the line, the other guy will deal with the debt. All of those things lend itself to short-termism. For example, not spending adequate money on education. There's hardly any better investment in terms of productivity. The return on investment for education is just enormous, plus it makes a fairer system, but there are structural reasons. And so there is a short-termism, of course, and that creates a cycle. Like if I borrow, I spend more, but then I have to pay back in the future, and that creates a cycle. And of course, when the time for paying back in the future comes, because that's painful, then they will print more money to make that easier, which will devalue the money. That's it. That's right. There's a cycle. I grew up in the United States. As far as I'm concerned, I would love to keep it exactly like it's been, right? In other words, the element of freedom, the flexibility of choice, the choice by the people, and so on. Sometimes they may not make the best choices, but they have the flexibility and it's in their interest. And if it works well, it's just such a fabulous system. And then what you see in the cycles, you just see the mechanics of the cycles. And it went back to Plato and his describe of the Republic. In a sense, what you have is a democracy, because democracy has existed, for thousands of years, really. And democracy, the big risk of democracy is anarchy. When you have bad conditions and people start fighting with each other, then there's the issue of who's going to get control of those places. And so you have the 1930 to 45 period, you had 4 democracies choose to be autocracies. Their parliaments chose it. That happened in Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain. They said, somebody get control of this. And so that disorder leads to the strong, Plato would say, that then you ideally have the benevolent despot, who is sort of, okay, I'll take control, I'll make the trains run on time, and we'll take care of that. And then with time, you get the sort of the evil despot, who is then operating that way, and nobody can sustain that. You always have to have the change. And so then you have the revolution again, and then you kind of keep on with the process. So there tends to be a cycle of those types of things, and we have to know our vulnerabilities. So to keep what we cherish, we have to behave well with each other, respect the rule of law, respect the Constitution, respect thoughtful disagreement, and work together. And then we have, what we ideally aspire to, I think. In fact, there are many cases. A great leader, you watch these arcs, will win the war, will then have to deal with the remaining opposition. So they have to consolidate power to go on their mission in some way or another. They have to bring about stopping the fighting internally. And then they build a system that starts to improve things. And you could see the arcs in the charts in the book, because you could see, okay, education is the leading indicator. You start with education, you start with the system, and then you build that particular system. And then they also has to build a system that transitions well to the next leader, because no leaders last as long as a good empire or a good dynasty. So you have to have a transition of a system. And democracy in the United States has worked pretty damn well. We only had one civil war, but it requires the cherishing of it and the operating that way in order for that arc to continue. So I think you can see in these cases over and over again what's good, what's bad, and you can see the consequences. And yes, I think about the post-World War II period. What a wonderful period that was for the United States and the world, and also for Americans who had a middle class and they were in it together and they restructured things and they built things and they worked together, and then we have the cycle get overextended. So that's how it looks to me. History in China is their religion. They study it. Every senior person can go back and to take each of the dynasties. And they have amazing detail history that they recorded way back then. So when they say civilization, what they really mean is like they had bureaucracies, then civilized, and records and all of those things. And they see these cycles happening over and over again. I studied the dynasties. It starts, China was united in 221 BC, and you could see these cycles happen. And they all have it in their mind. And so a leader in China will view himself as what part of the cycle is he in. So let's say there's a new order. Their new order began in 1949. The Communist Party takes over, Mao Zedong comes in. Then there's a classic script: consolidate power and then start to make the changes. Then fast forward, Deng Xiaoping comes in, and then how do you get richer and you modernize it? And they went through that particular process. And then each leader knows where they are in that cycle and how to operate in that cycle. It's top of mind because they've seen the stories happen over and over again. It's a longer term history. It's not a 9-month perspective. That is how the thinking works. I think China's far more complicated, and there are terrible misunderstandings. It's very difficult to just summarize those things. There are very, very, very different perspectives of Chinese living in China. For example, having all their information public and controlled by the government and all the data. Like they would say, that gives me comfort and safety or something. Or having their kids, the government says, your kids can't do video games more than an hour a day. Now, in the United States, they would say, hey, that's a parental decision. What the hell is the government doing deciding that in there? So these things become very complicated. And in all countries, there's a reading into all different things. So I can't really possibly summarize all of that in terms of the reactions. There are different approaches, certainly. And so I think it is definitely a more autocratic, top-down approach versus one of the Chinese leaders described me, the United States is a country of individuals and individualism, and that makes it bottom up. And so there are different perspectives, but it's complicated. I think the main thing here is, to whatever extent there can be an understanding, fine, that would be good. But to realize, let's focus internally on how strong we can be, making our system work well, and so on. And different people will have different systems, but let's be as competitive as we can by doing the tried and true things right. And we know what those things are. In all societies, if you go back to China, what meritocracy, some would say, began with Confucius and meritocracy and exams and how they did it. And you could see it in different cultures, that one thing, like you have to create that, and together to create productivity that raises living standards and so on. And then, of course, with consideration in terms of helping those who can't help themselves. But by and large, that's been a tried and true thing through that whole period of time. Because you have to make things better and you've got to pay for them too. And so to the extent that each individual is as self-sufficient as possible and you enable them, that they can pay for it and they can contribute the most. That's never perfect and so on, but that notion is basically universally and timelessly ingredients for a successful society and a fair society. I think we need a bold step, and simultaneously, those are in many cases great investments if done well to pay for themselves through their productivity. We encountered that when COVID came along, this population didn't have computers and didn't have connectivity. Okay, that's like not having water or not having electricity. Okay, like it's basic. When you look at some of these things, that kind of infrastructure in terms of those basics is a great return on investment, as well as something that makes the system fair. And there are a lot of those. So you have to be conscious about those types of things. But do you get to pay for it, and how does that work? Because there's a financial part of this that has to also work, right? Because when you create a debt and you're selling the debt, there are buyers of that debt. So there's a supply demand. And if they don't buy that debt, then you have a problem that you have to print a lot of money and then you produce an inflation. And so how you balance those things requires both a skill level and a sense of what the objective is, right? In other words, you have to have the skill to know how to balance those things. That's an economic financial skill. How do you produce those things and so on? And then how do you sell the bonds to balance those things? And then you have to have the goal in mind. And that goal has to be really that kind of equal opportunity and drawing. So you're being both productive and also creating, prosperity that the majority of people benefit from. There are different conflict measures. I created conflict gauges. There are different kinds of conflict. If you were to go back, you would go to the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King demonstrations, and so on in 1967, 68, 69-ish was a period of general. And then you go back to the Civil War period. If you take political conflict, we're in most conflicts since 1900. By any measures, we have high right now conflict. Is this the all-time record? It depends on which ones you're looking at. Well, that's what the picture looks like. I gave 18 indicators with measurements for each, so there are numbers on each of those indicators. I don't want to take you through all 18. I gave you 3, which is the financial condition, the internal conflict, the external conflict. Number 4, in terms of big things in history, is acts of nature have killed more people and caused more civilizations to change. But they're kind of the random things like the pandemic or a drought or something that's coming along. Also then innovation and then share of world GDP for trade. How competitiveness are you in the world? Education in terms of all the measures is very important. Those would be the most important ones. There's the attack. Like if you're more vulnerable and I'm a competitor, at the most vulnerable moment, I'm more likely to cause you harm. And that internally, it's to find the external enemy that will galvanize the country. In the animal species, when does the one take down the other? The other gets older or more vulnerable and the attack comes, and that's when it happens, right? You don't want to go attack somebody who's going to be stronger than you. You don't pick a fight. But you look for the vulnerable moments and then you attack during that vulnerability, and then you have the galvanizing, and both of those are at work. Taiwan, I would say if it wasn't for the Taiwan issue, which is a ticking time bomb, then what you would probably have is the intense competition in the areas I said, trade, technology, capital wars, and geopolitical influence. So if you're talking about a military, it's an existential issue. And then China and Russia have close relationships. There's always in history, there's the common enemy, draws others together. Their equivalent to Taiwan is the Ukraine. And for them, that means that it's the neighboring place that they believe is in their sphere of influence, and that there's threats if they don't control it and they won't tolerate. That's an existential question for them. It would be, like NATO setting up on their borders is to them something like Russia or China setting up in Mexico or something. And so there are those geopolitical issues, and that's how the world is changing, because also the power differences have narrowed in the ways that we're talking about, the military powers. And by the way, the capacities in all the different ways to do harm to each other have advanced at least as much as all other technologies have advanced since the last war. It would be terrible if we got into that kind of war, but you pick the number one hotspot. What should individuals do so that we have a better society and better chances of going forward? Or what should individuals do assuming that they can't determine that? What we should do as a country, in my opinion, it's very simple. We should understand and worry about that dynamic and work together in a bipartisan way. Basically what I would be doing is, if I was president of the United States, I'd probably have a bipartisan cabinet. The middle and working together is going to be fundamentally the most important thing we can do, I believe, collectively. Individually, it is to really understand this. Understand the patterns, understand the particulars, some of the things we talked about that are, how does an individual store wealth? How does that work? In other words, I think, for example, an investor should have like 2 portfolios. The first portfolio is the I will be okay portfolio. In other words, it's a diversified portfolio of things that if things were not good, it's like your insurance policy. I'm covered. about those things. So to know how to do that, and then you have the what's good, generally speaking, type of portfolio. And then things to know about the measurements and to move when not to move, or where does that work for, to know how it works. So I think that would be important. That's one of the big reasons I wrote the book. I tried to be as accurate as I'm saying, and I want to be mechanical and probabilistic. As I say, I think that there is something like a 30% chance of the internal conflict that becomes disorderly, a civil war of sorts. And I think that there's, 35% chance of that. I'm trying to be as accurate. And I think it's pretty easy to watch the dot plot and see where we're going and how close to the edge you are as leading indicators.